Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Max Scheler begins the third part of his work Ressentiment by saying, Friedrich Nietzsche characterizes the idea of Christian love as what he calls the most delicate flower of ressentiment, and he goes on to say he believes that through this idea, the ressentiment accumulated by an oppressed and at the same time vindictive nation whose God was the God of revenge, even when it was still politically and socially independent, is justified before this nation's consciousness. So he's seeing, as we know from the genealogy, Christianity emerging as a movement from Judaism, a lot of different movements within Judaism at the time, and as being sort of a crystallization of not love, but a love that is actually a masquerade for hatred, for the desire to take vengeance on the strong. And this is what he views as characteristic of Christianity. And he says that if we fully appreciate the revolutionary character of the change, which leads from the ancient to the Christian idea of love, which Scheler is going to spell out for us, Nietzsche himself has done this only vaguely and inexactly. This Nietzschean statement is much less paradoxical than would appear at first sight. And here he's going to say something quite paradoxical. Nietzsche has made a very profound discovery. However, he also says that I consider his theory to be completely mistaken. So how can you possibly make a profound, and as he's going to say a little bit later, important discovery that turns out to be completely mistaken? Well, it's not completely mistaken, but there are some aspects of Nietzsche's viewpoint on Christianity that Scheler is going to criticize, and he's going to engage in this at considerable length. And so later on, when he turns specifically to Nietzsche, he's going to say, when a hypothesis has the profundity of Nietzsche's speculation about the origin of Christian morality, it's not enough to reject it as false. Instead, we've got to do something more. We have to show, first, how Nietzsche was led to his error, and second, how it could gain for him such a high degree of probability. This is to understand Nietzsche's mistaken perspective. And this is something that philosophers do quite frequently, going all the way back to Plato's time. It's not enough just to say somebody's wrong. You've got to explain what they've got wrong. And then you've also got to think about how is it that a reasonable person, even a brilliant person, could in fact get something so wrong. And so Scheler here in this work is going to attribute it to two main factors, two reasons, as he says. So one is, you could say, an error in interpretation, which is in significant part driven by Nietzsche's own preconceptions. Now, Nietzsche tries to, as most philosophers do, question his own preconceptions, to call them into question, to identify them, but he doesn't completely succeed. And so Scheler is going to say that Nietzsche misjudged the essence of Christian morality. which is love. Nietzsche didn't really understand love in the Christian sense. He understood some aspects of it, and this is where we get to the second part. There's also factual deformations, as Scheler is going to talk about it. Factual deformations which Christian morality, starting with its early history, has undergone through reciprocal interchanges with values which sprung from an entirely different historical background, and these often remain decisive for its future history. So, we could think about Christianity's, various accommodations, and it's not Christianity per se, but Christians in this culture, Christians in this place, to things that are not really Christian. Scheler, for example, is going to say Christianity is not about dominating society. It actually has to be this, essentially aristocratic religion of love. You can't make people love other people. So the notion of, what we nowadays call Christian integralism, totally foreign to actual Christianity, according to Scheler, right? But Nietzsche could be looking at these mix-ups, these deformations of Christianity, taking them as being characteristic of it. And, Nietzsche himself is growing up in a society which his dad is actually, a religious figure, and he's getting Christianity thrust on him from all different areas and points of view. It's no surprise that he would be mistaken about this. And so what are the ways in which Nietzsche get things wrong? Scheler is going to identify a number of these. One occurred a little bit earlier, where he's talking about ascetic ideals. And Nietzsche actually, the very third part of the genealogy of moral is, what is the meaning of ascetic ideals, right? So this is something really, really important for Nietzsche. And Scheler had shown that ascetic ideals, value judgments, actions can stem from different sources. They don't all stem from the same thing. Nietzsche views ascetic ideals as what Scheler here is going to call the value reflex of a declining and exhausted life which secretly seeks death, even if its conscious will is different. For Nietzsche, Christian asceticism as well falls under the rules and valuations which spring from ressentiment. So we've got declining life, we've got ressentiment, and this is what Nietzsche, in fact, does say in the Genealogy of Morals, very explicitly in the third essay. So Scheler says, well, you got some of it right, but that's not the totality of Christian asceticism. As a matter of fact, a lot of it doesn't fit under this rubric well at all. A little bit later, he's going to say that here's another way Nietzsche gets things wrong. There can be no doubt that the Christian ethos is inseparable from the Christian religion's conception of God and the world. It's meaningless without this foundation. Now, is it really meaningless? Yes and no. So you can't get the full meaning of authentic Christianity. What you can get are these deformations coming out of it, right? So if you separate the Christian ethos or morality from the notion of the kingdom of God, then, you're going to run into all sorts of problems. So he says, Christian morality must be tied to Christian religion by what? The assumption of a spiritual realm whose objects, contents, and values transcend not only the sensory sphere, but also the whole sphere of life. This is what Jesus calls, according to Scheler, the kingdom of God. So he says love, the communion based on it, these may work out in the secular forms of community, and they may further material welfare, they may free us from pain and create pleasure. All of this is of value only if these communities and the forces of love which cement them have their living roots. Now notice that, not just historical roots, living roots, if they remain connected in continuity with the kingdom of God and refer back to it. So he says the affirmation does not say to what degree the kingdom of God is represented as transcendent, otherworldly, or as immanent and active in the world, but it is understood as being something extra, something, above, something greater. And Nietzsche missed this. Nietzsche just didn't get that. Instead, Nietzsche is going to focus, as he says, on biological values. And if you do that, then he says Christian values and all imperatives that spring from them must be referred to a standard which would make them appear as values of decadence in the biological sense. The standard of which is of what is most conducive to life. And he says this is Nietzsche's interpretation. Christianity is just one more form, perhaps the most successful form of a decadent revaluation of values. And so Scheler is going to tell us that, that's getting things wrong. Why? Because life, biological values, vital values as he calls them elsewhere, are not the highest values. Nietzsche caps it at that point. That's as high as you can get. Maybe to some degree what Scheler calls geistige, spiritual values. Maybe some of them could be incorporated, but for the most part it's vital values. And Nietzsche doesn't see anything higher than that. Scheler says love is not seen as a spiritual activity which serves life. It is the activity and movement of love which imbues life with its highest meaning and value. You can only get life in the fullest when it's connected to something that transcends life, you could say. So we can be asked to renounce life, not only to sacrifice individual life for collective life, one's own life for somebody else's, or lower forms for higher forms of life. We can be asked to sacrifice life as such, in its very essence, if such an act would further the values of the kingdom of God, whose mystic bond and spiritual strength, source of strength, is love. So this is where he thinks Nietzsche is really getting Christianity wrong. He interprets Christianity as a morality with a religious window dressing, or as he's going to call it here, justification, but not primarily as a religion, because Nietzsche can't actually grasp religions as religions, but only as certain moral responses to the problems of life. So this is a gap in Nietzsche's own point of view, and he says because of this, he's going to apply to Christian values a standard which they themselves refuse consciously. So this is really important here. He's not just saying Nietzsche got Christianity wrong, but it's understandable because, the Christians themselves are confused about this. No, Christianity is clear about this, and Nietzsche almost steered himself wrong, you could say, right? He goes on and says, this is philosophically wrong and strictly refutable. And he says, I'm not going to do that here, short work, right? But he does that elsewhere. And then he goes on and he says, Nietzsche made another mistake. If the Christian precepts and imperatives, especially those which refer to love, are detached from the kingdom of God and from man's spiritual personality, there's another serious consequence, which is that the kingdom of God, man's spiritual core, right, is going to be detached from all the laws which govern the development, growth, and expansion of life. So what it is that's required of us by love, what our value response is going to be inevitably at odds with what life requires of us. And what does he mean by that? Well, he's going to talk about the organization of society, conflict, all of those sorts of matters. And it doesn't actually have to be that way unless you misunderstand Christianity. And so he says that, what Nietzsche got wrong is he relied on a confused picture of Jesus. He says, Friedrich Nietzsche's own conception of Christianity is strongly influenced by a widespread Jesus picture which was propagated by Christian and non-Christian socialists. Therefore, he thinks that the motives and arguments which set him, Nietzsche, against modern socialism and communism also apply to Christianity, Christian morality, and its genius. And then he says, but Nietzsche's attack touches Jesus and the core of Christianity as little as the praise of those socialists. Both are making the same modern mistaken premise, right? Christianity isn't about equalizing everything. It's not about transforming this world for its own sake. It may actually have that function. It has, in fact, historically had that function. But it's about something that transcends this world. Nietzsche just doesn't get that, according to Scheler, in part because, again, he is looking at factual deformations of Christian morality, in this case in terms of Christian socialism and reinterpretations of Christianity by those who'd like to claim it, who aren't Christians. And he says, aha, see, ressentiment there, just like it is over there. And so, essentially what this boils down to is Scheler is saying on a number of different points, Nietzsche has gotten Christianity wrong, but wrong in a very interesting way, which does very well target deformations of Christianity, but doesn't get at the essence of Christianity, which is this kingdom of God and what, the glue that holds it all together, love.